Imagine a boy, 13 years old, standing at the edge of a small village in ancient Galilee. He has never seen the ocean. He has never left home. And yet, something is pulling him forward, something no one around him can explain. His mother called him Yeshua. The world would later call him Jesus of Nazareth. And this is where the story gets strange. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are among the most studied texts in human history. Billions of words have been written about them. Billions of people have built their lives around them. And yet, all four Gospels combined give us fewer than one paragraph about 18 years of this man's life. 18 years. Luke chapter 2, verse 52. 4 words in the original Greek. Jesus increased in wisdom, and then silence. Complete silence. For nearly 2 decades. Think about that for a moment. If you were writing the story of the most influential person who ever lived, a man whose words would reshape civilization, would you skip 18 years? Would you write 4 words and move on? Something happened during those years. Something that turned a boy from a village of 400 people, a village so small it doesn't appear on most Roman maps of the time, into a man who would change the course of human history. The question is, what? Now here is where it gets truly interesting, because we are not the first people to ask that question. 5 ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, speaking different languages, following different gods. Each of them looked at that same silence, and each of them tried to answer it. Some of what they recorded is historically documented. Some of it is widely debated among scholars, and some of it, mainstream history has almost completely ignored. Today we explore all of it, not to tell you what to believe, but to show you what 5 different corners of the ancient world believed, and let you decide what to make of it. Before we go any further, one thing I want to be clear about. Some of what you are about to hear has strong historical support. Some of it remains contested among historians and scholars. And some traditions claim things that most academics consider unlikely. We will be honest about which is which, every step of the way, because you deserve the full picture, not just the parts that make a good story. Now, some of these ancient traditions claim that Jesus may have traveled as far as India, spending years studying with spiritual masters the Western world had never heard of. Whether that is history or legend is something we will explore together. But I will tell you this much right now. The answer to where Jesus went during those 18 years may have been hiding in plain sight. Recorded by 5 civilizations, in 5 different languages, for over 2,000 years. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Historical context. To understand why these 18 years matter so much, we need to understand where Jesus came from. Not spiritually. Historically, Nazareth, 1st century Galilee, a village so small, so remote, that it is never once mentioned in the Old Testament. Never mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus. Never referenced in the Talmud. 400 people. No running water. No school. No synagogue large enough to matter. No library. No connection to the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Imagine growing up there. Your entire world contained within walking distance. The same faces every day. The same conversations. The same horizon. And then, at the age of 30, this man from that village steps forward, and begins to speak. And what comes out of his mouth stops people cold? Roman soldiers pause to listen. Jewish scholars, men who had spent their entire lives studying Scripture, find themselves unable to answer his questions. Crowds of thousands follow him into the desert, without food, without shelter, just to hear him speak. Where did that come from? Where does a carpenter's son from a village of 400 people develop the kind of wisdom that silences scholars, the kind of authority that makes soldiers hesitate, the kind of presence that draws thousands into the wilderness? That is not a spiritual question. That is a historical one, and mainstream scholarship has never fully answered it. No, the traditional explanation is simple. Jesus was divine. His wisdom came from God. And for billions of people around the world, that answer is complete. That answer is enough. We respect that fully. But for historians, for archaeologists, for anyone who wants to understand the human story behind the spiritual one, the question remains open. And what makes it fascinating is that the ancient world noticed the same gap we notice today. Here is something most people do not know. The first century Mediterranean world was far more connected than most of us imagine. Trade routes stretched from Rome to China. Merchants carried not just goods, but ideas, philosophies, sacred texts, stories of teachers and prophets from lands most people had never seen. Jewish communities existed across the ancient world, in Alexandria, in Babylon, in Persia, in India. Some historians believe there were Jewish settlements as far east as southern India. As early as the 6th century before the Common Era, a young man from Galilee, traveling east along these trade routes, would not have been unusual, would not have been impossible, would not have been remarkable to anyone watching him walk away. What would have been remarkable is what he brought back, and that is exactly what 5 ancient civilizations claimed to have witnessed. Starting with the civilization closest to home, starting with a group of men who the Bible itself tells us came looking for him first. Chapter 2. First, civilization, Persia, Zoroastrian. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the beginning of his life. Matthew chapter 2. A group of men arrive in Jerusalem. They have traveled from the east. They are following a star, and they are looking for a child. Most of us grew up calling them the 3 wise men. But that is not what the original Greek text calls them. The word Matthew uses is magi, mahoi in Greek, and that word has a very specific meaning. The magi were not simply wise men. They were not astrologers in the casual sense. They were priests, Zoroastrian priests, from Persia, members of one of the most sophisticated religious traditions the ancient world had ever produced. Think about what that means. These were not curious travelers who happened to see an interesting star. These were highly educated religious scholars who had been studying ancient prophecies for generations, and who believed, with complete certainty, that those prophecies were pointing them toward a specific child, in a specific place, at a specific moment in history. Now, here is the question that most Sunday school lessons never ask. Why were Persian priests studying Jewish prophecy? Why would Zoroastrian scholars care about the birth of a Jewish child? The answer takes us deep into one of history's most fascinating and most overlooked connections. Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest religions on earth. Some scholars date its origins to as early as 1500 years before the Common Era, possibly earlier. It was founded by a prophet named Zarathustra, known in the Greek world as Zoroaster, and at its center was a belief that would sound remarkably familiar to anyone raised in the Christian tradition. Zoroastrianism taught that history was a great cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between truth and lies, between a force of good and a force of evil, and at the end of that struggle, a figure would appear, a savior, someone who would tip the balance and bring about the final triumph of light over darkness. They called this figure the Saoshyant. Now, some scholars have pointed out striking parallels between the concept of the Saoshyant and the figure of Jesus as described in the Gospels. Both are described as born of a virgin. Both are associated with a cosmic battle between good and evil. Both are expected to judge the living and the dead. Both are connected to the concept of resurrection. However, and this is important, there is no direct historical evidence that these parallels represent deliberate borrowing. Many scholars argue that these similarities reflect common human spiritual intuitions, rather than direct cultural exchange. Others believe the connections are too specific to be coincidental. The debate continues among historians and religious scholars today. What we can say with confidence is that the Magi in Matthew's Gospel were real historical figures, real Zoroastrian priests, who made a real journey, and who believed, based on their own ancient texts, that something significant was happening in Judea. Now imagine this. These men arrive. They find the child they were looking for. They offer their gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, three substances that were not simply valuable. They were sacred, used in the highest religious rituals of the Zoroastrian tradition. And then they leave. They return to the east, back to Persia, back to their temples, back to their scrolls. But here is the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Did they leave alone? Some ancient Persian traditions, and we want to be clear that these traditions are not universally accepted by scholars, suggest that the relationship between the Magi and the family of Jesus did not end that night in Bethlehem. Some accounts suggest that a promise was made, that the child would one day be sent east, to be educated in the traditions that had predicted his arrival. Now, most mainstream historians treat these traditions with significant skepticism. There is no verified historical document that confirms this claim, and we are not presenting it as fact. We are presenting it as part of a larger pattern, a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore as we move from civilization to civilization. Because here is what we can say. When Jesus begins his public ministry at the age of 30, his teachings contain ideas that scholars have identified as remarkably consistent with concepts from outside the Jewish tradition. The emphasis on inner transformation over outward ritual, the idea that the kingdom of God exists within a person, not in a temple or a building. The teaching that compassion toward enemies is not weakness, but a form of spiritual strength. Some scholars have pointed out that these ideas have strong parallels in Zoroastrian ethical philosophy. However, as we said, parallel does not mean borrowed, and we want to be honest about the limits of what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence does show is this. A group of Persian religious scholars believed, based on centuries of their own sacred writing, that this child mattered enough to cross a desert for, mattered enough to bring their most sacred offerings to. And they came from the east, which is exactly the direction that the next civilization in our story claim Jesus eventually traveled toward, further east than Persia, further east than anyone in Nazareth had ever gone, to a land of ancient rivers and sacred mountains, to a tradition that would make a claim far more specific and far more controversial than anything the Zoroastrians ever wrote. Chapter 3. Second and Third, Civilization, India and Tibet. Before we go any further, I want to stop and be completely honest with you. What you are about to hear is one of the most debated claims in the entire field of historical Jesus studies. The primary source we are going to discuss has been heavily criticized by mainstream scholarship. Some historians consider it unreliable. Some consider it a fabrication. We are including it not because it is confirmed history, but because it is a significant part of the conversation around this mystery, and you deserve to hear it with full context, with full transparency. That is the only way we know how to do this. So, let's talk about a man named Nicholas Notovich. The year was 1887. A Russian journalist and traveler was making his way through the Himalayan region of Ladakh. In what is now northern India, he had broken his leg during the journey, and while recovering, he found himself as a guest at a remote Buddhist monastery, a place called Hemis, and it was there, according to Notovich, that a monk showed him something extraordinary, an ancien manuscript, written on yellowed parchment, in the Pali language. The manuscript, according to Notovich's account, told the story of a young man from the West, a young man the text called Isa. Now, Isa is simply the Eastern form of the name Jesus, used in Islamic tradition, used in some Buddhist texts, used across a wide region of Asia to refer to the same historical figure. And according to this manuscript, Isa had not spent his missing years in Nazareth. He had traveled east, along the ancient trade routes, through Persia, through Afghanistan, and into the Indian subcontinent. The text claimed that Isa spent years studying with Hindu Brahmin priests in the sacred city of Varanasi, learning the ancient Vedic scriptures, debating with scholars, teaching the poor and the outcasts, which apparently got him into trouble even there. And then, according to the same account, he traveled further north, into the high mountains, into Tibet, where he spent time in Buddhist monasteries, studying, meditating, learning, before eventually making his way back west, toward Judea, toward the Jordan River, toward John the Baptist, toward the beginning of everything the Gospels record. Now, here is where we have to be very careful and very honest. When Notovich published his account in a book titled The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, published in 1894, the reaction from the scholarly community was swift and largely negative. Professor Friedrich Max Müller, one of the leading experts in Eastern religions at Oxford University, investigated Notovich's claims directly. He wrote to the head monk at Hemis Monastery. The response he received was that no such manuscript existed, that no Western traveler matching Notovich's description had ever stayed there, and that no monk had ever shown anyone a text about Isa. Other scholars made the journey to Hemis themselves. They found no manuscript, no record of Notovich's visit, no evidence that the text he described had ever existed. To this day, no independent verification of the original manuscript has been possible. Most historians consider this claim widely disputed at best, a 19th century fabrication at worst. We want to be completely clear about that. And yet, The story did not disappear. In 1922, a scholar named Swami Abhedananda claimed to have visited Hemis and to have seen a different version of the same manuscript. In 1925, the Russian artist and explorer Nicholas Roerich reported hearing similar traditions about Isa from multiple sources across Central Asia. None of these accounts have been independently verified. None of them constitute historical proof. But here is what is interesting. Here is the part that even skeptical historians find difficult to simply dismiss. You do not need the Notovich manuscript to notice that something unusual is happening when you place the teachings of Jesus alongside the teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha lived approximately 5 centuries before Jesus. In northern India, his teachings were spreading rapidly across Asia and along trade routes into the Middle East. During exactly the period when Jesus was alive, and when you read them side by side, the parallels are, at minimum, remarkable. The Buddha taught, "Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself." Jesus taught, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." The Buddha taught that attachment to material things is the root of suffering. Jesus taught, "Do not store up treasures on earth." The Buddha taught that inner transformation must precede outward action. Jesus taught, "First clean the inside of the cup." The Buddha described a path of compassion that extended even to those who caused harm. Jesus said, "Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." Now, do these parallels prove that Jesus traveled to India? No, they do not. Do they prove that Jesus studied Buddhist texts? No, they do not prove that either. Some scholars argue that these similarities reflect universal human spiritual wisdom, ideas that independent traditions arrive at separately. Because they are simply true, others argue that the trade routes of the first century made the spread of Buddhist ideas into the Middle East not just possible, but likely. The historian Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University, has noted that the intellectual environment of first-century Judaism was far more open to outside influence than traditional accounts suggest. Marcus Borg, one of the most respected Jesus scholars of the 20th century, wrote extensively about the similarities between Jesus and the Buddha, without claiming direct contact, but without dismissing the question either. The honest answer is that we do not know. We do not know if Jesus traveled to India. We do not know if he studied with Buddhist masters. We do not know if the Notovich manuscript ever existed. What we do know is this: a boy from a village of 400 people, with no access to formal education, with no known contact with the great intellectual traditions of his time, emerged at the age of 30, teaching ideas that bear a striking resemblance to the most sophisticated spiritual philosophies developed thousands of miles away. And whether that happened because he traveled there, or because truth has a way of arriving independently in every corner of the human heart, is a question that 2,000 years of history has not yet answered. Perhaps that is the point, because the next civilization in our story doesn't deal in legends or disputed manuscripts. It deals in something far more concrete, something the Bible itself confirms, something that places Jesus in one of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world ever produced. Chapter 4, Fourth and Fifth Civilization, Egypt and Alexandria Deep Dive. This is the part of our story that requires no disputed manuscripts, no controversial travelers, no claims that historians have spent a century arguing about. This part comes straight from the Bible itself, Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. An angel appears to Joseph in a dream. The message is urgent. Take the child and his mother. Flee to Egypt. Now, tonight. And so they went. A young family. Refugees. Crossing the Sinai desert with nothing but what they could carry. Fleeing a king who wanted their child dead. And they arrived in Egypt. Now, most people who have read this story picture a family hiding in the desert, somewhere quiet, somewhere remote, somewhere safe and forgotten. But that is almost certainly not what happened, because the Egypt that Joseph and Mary entered was not a quiet place. It was not remote. It was not forgotten. The Egypt of the first century was home to one of the most extraordinary cities in the entire history of human civilization. Alexandria. Take a moment to understand what Alexandria was. Founded by Alexander the Great in the 4th century, before the Common Era. Alexandria had grown into the intellectual capital of the world. Its population exceeded 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on earth at that time. It was home to the Great Library of Alexandria, the largest collection of written knowledge ever assembled in the ancient world. Scholars estimate it contained, at its peak, between 400,000 and 700,000 individual scrolls. Every major philosophical tradition of the ancient world passed through Alexandria. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Persian mysticism, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Jewish scripture, all of it, in one place. And here is something that most people do not know. Alexandria was home to the largest Jewish community in the entire ancient world. Larger than Jerusalem itself. Jewish scholars in Alexandria were not isolated from the intellectual life of the city. They were at the center of it. They were translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, creating what became known as the Septuagint, the version of the Old Testament that most early Christians actually read. They were engaging with Greek philosophy, wrestling with Plato, debating Aristotle, trying to understand how the God of Abraham related to the cosmic principles that Greek thinkers had spent centuries describing. And the man who stood at the center of all of this was a Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. Philo was born approximately 20 years before Jesus. He died approximately 50 years after Jesus was born. In other words, he was alive at exactly the same time, living in exactly the same city that the Bible tells us Jesus' family fled to. Philo spent his life trying to bridge two worlds, the world of Jewish scripture and the world of Greek philosophical thought. He developed a concept that he called the Logos, the divine word, the rational principle through which God created and sustained the universe. Now, read the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek word John uses is logos, the same word, the same concept, developed in the same city, by a Jewish philosopher living at the same time as the family the Bible tells us was there. Now, we want to be careful here. Some scholars have pointed out this connection as evidence of direct intellectual influence. Others argue that the concept of the Logos was widespread enough in first-century Jewish thought that no direct connection to Alexandria is required. There is no document that places Jesus himself in Alexandria. There is no text that says he studied with Philo or read the scrolls in the Great Library. What we can say is something far simpler, and in some ways, far more powerful. The Bible tells us his family was there. The greatest library in human history was there. The most sophisticated Jewish intellectual community in the world was there. The very concepts that would later appear in the Gospel of John were being developed there. At exactly that time, we cannot say Jesus studied there, but we can say the ideas were there, and so was he. Now, how long did the family stay in Egypt? The Bible does not give us a precise answer. Matthew simply says they remained until the death of Herod. Herod the Great died in approximately 4 years before the Common Era, which means the family may have been in Egypt for anywhere from several months to several years. Several years! In the greatest intellectual city on earth, at the precise moment when Jewish and Greek thought were being woven together into something entirely new. Now, here is what makes Alexandria even more significant when we zoom out and look at the larger picture. Alexandria was not just a place of Jewish and Greek thought. It was a crossroads, a meeting point for every major tradition we have discussed in this video. Zoroastrian ideas had traveled west along trade routes and were circulating in Alexandria. Buddhist philosophy had reached Egypt through merchant networks that connected India to the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptian religious traditions, including ideas about resurrection, divine judgment, and the afterlife, were part of the intellectual air that everyone in the city breathed. In other words, if you wanted to find one place where a young Jewish boy could have encountered the philosophical traditions of Persia, the spiritual teachings of India, and the ancient wisdom of Egypt, all at the same time, without traveling to each of those places individually, Alexandria was that place. Alexandria was the world, compressed into a single city. And whether Jesus spent months there or years, the intellectual environment alone would have been unlike anything he could have encountered in Nazareth, unlike anything in all of Galilee, unlike anything in all of Judea. One small family, refugees, in the greatest city on earth. We do not know what the child saw. We do not know what the child heard. We do not know which scrolls were read to him, or which conversations drifted through open windows into the room where he slept. But we know what he became. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary connection of all. 5 civilizations, 5 different languages, 5 different traditions, each of them looking at the same silence, and each of them feeling compelled to fill it. Persia said, "We went looking for him first." India said, "He came to us." Tibet said, "He sat with our monks in the mountains." Egypt said, "The Bible itself placed him here." And Alexandria said, "Everything he would later teach was already in the air." Now the question is, what do we actually do with all of this? What does it mean when 5 ancient civilizations independently reach toward the same mystery? That is exactly what we are going to explore in the next part of our journey. Chapter 5. Analysis and Personal Perspective. We have traveled a long way together, from the deserts of Persia to the mountains of Tibet to the libraries of Alexandria. And now it is time to step back, to look at everything we have seen with honest eyes. Because here is the truth that every serious exploration of this subject eventually arrives at. We do not know what happened during those 18 years. And anyone who tells you they do is not being straight with you. So let's look at this from every angle. Let's hear every voice, starting with the voice that mainstream scholarship speaks with. The skeptical position. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. and one of the most widely read New Testament scholars alive today, has addressed this question directly. His position is clear. There is no credible historical evidence that Jesus traveled outside of Judea and Galilee during his early years. The Notovich manuscript has never been verified. The Persian traditions about Jesus traveling east are not supported by any document that historians can date to the 1st century. The Buddhist parallels, while interesting, do not require direct contact to explain. Ehrman argues, and he is not alone, that the most historically responsible position is simply this: we do not know what Jesus did during those years. The Gospels do not tell us, and the absence of information is not an invitation to fill the gap with speculation. That is a serious argument, made by serious scholars, and it deserves to be heard fully. The historian Richard Carrier has made a similar point. When ancient sources make extraordinary claims, we require extraordinary evidence. The traditions we explored today do not meet that standard. Not the Indian manuscripts, not the Persian connections, not even the Alexandria parallels, which are suggestive but not conclusive. These are fair points, honest points, points that any serious exploration of this subject has to reckon with. And yet, there is another voice, a voice that has been speaking for 2,000 years, and that voice deserves equal respect. The traditional theological position for the majority of Christian believers around the world, the silence of the Gospels about those 18 years is not a problem to be solved. It is not a mystery to be unraveled. It is a theological statement. The Gospels were not written as biographies in the modern sense of the word. They were written as testimony, as proclamation, as declarations of who Jesus was, not simply records of what he did. From this perspective, the 18 years of silence are intentional. What matters is not where Jesus was, or what he studied, or who taught him. What matters is who he was, and what he said, and what happened on the third day. For billions of people, that framework is not a limitation. It is the entire point, and we say this with complete sincerity, not as a disclaimer, but as a recognition that this perspective has sustained the lives of more human beings than any other framework in history. That is not nothing. That is not something to be explained away. Now, here is where I want to speak to you, not as a narrator, not as a researcher, but simply as someone who has spent a long time sitting with these questions, after going through every source we discussed today, after reading the scholars on every side, after sitting with the traditions and the counter-arguments and the verified history and the disputed legends. Here is what strikes me most. It is not the Notovich manuscript. It is not the Zoroastrian prophecies. It is not even the extraordinary intellectual environment of Alexandria. What strikes me most is the fact that human beings, on opposite ends of the ancient world, who had never met each other, who did not share a language, or a religion, or a culture, all felt the same pull. They all looked at this man, and they all felt that the official story was incomplete. Persian priests crossed a desert because their own traditions told them something was happening. A Russian traveler claimed to have found a manuscript in a monastery at the top of the world. Buddhist monks, according to some accounts, preserve stories about a wandering teacher from the West. And the greatest city in the ancient world happened to be exactly where the Bible says his family fled. Now maybe all of that is coincidence. Maybe the skeptics are right, and the silence of the Gospels should simply remain silent. Maybe the theological answer is the complete answer, and the question itself is the wrong question to be asking. I genuinely do not know. But here is what I do know. The questions that 5 ancient civilizations felt compelled to ask are the same questions that brought you here today. And that tells us something profound, not about where Jesus went, but about us, about the human need to understand the people who change everything, to find the origin of greatness, to trace wisdom back to its source, to believe that transformation on that scale must have a story behind it. Some questions are not meant to be answered. Some questions are meant to be lived with, carried, turned over in the mind late at night, when the world is quiet and the mystery feels very close. This is one of those questions. Let's go back to the beginning. A boy, 13 years old, standing at the edge of a small village in ancient Galilee. We started there, and in a way, we never really left, because that is where the mystery lives. Not in the manuscripts of India, not in the prophecies of Persia, not in the libraries of Alexandria. The mystery lives in the space between who he was and who he became. 18 years, 4 words, and a silence that 5 ancient civilizations could not leave alone. We explored what Persia recorded. We examined what India and Tibet claimed. We looked at what Egypt and the greatest intellectual city in the ancient world may have offered. We heard the skeptics. We heard the believers. We sat with the uncertainty. And here is where we land. Not with an answer, because there is no answer that all the evidence supports completely, but with something that may be more valuable than an answer. A deeper question: what does it mean when a man emerges from 18 years of silence and proceeds to say things that no one around him had ever heard before? What does it mean when 5 civilizations, each with their own gods, their own prophets, their own sacred texts, all reach toward the same figure? What does it mean that 2,000 years later, you and I are still asking the same questions that monks in Tibet were asking, that priests in Persia were asking, that scholars in Alexandria were asking 2,000 years ago? I don't think that is a coincidence. I don't think that is an accident. I think that is what it looks like when a question is real, when a mystery actually matters. And if this question stayed with you after everything we explored today, if you find yourself still turning it over, still wondering, still reaching, that is exactly why we are here. That feeling you have right now, that pull towards something just out of reach, that is the same feeling that drove 5 ancient civilizations to pick up a pen and write. You are not alone in that feeling. You never were. Next week, on Sacred Scrolls, we go even deeper. A text discovered in Egypt in 1896 contains words attributed to Mary Magdalene herself, words that were deliberately left out of every Bible translation you have ever read, words that describe a conversation between Mary and Jesus that the other apostles were never meant to hear. And the question it raises is even more unsettling than the one we explored today. If you want to be there when we open that text, subscribe to Sacred Scrolls. Hit the bell so you never miss a discovery. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Leave your answer in the comments below. Of the 5 civilizations we explored today, which one surprised you the most? And what do you think really happened during those 18 years? I read every comment, every single one, And the conversations that happen in this community are some of the most thoughtful, most honest, most searching conversations I have ever been part of. Because this is not just a YouTube channel. This is a community of people who refuse to stop asking hard questions. Welcome to Sacred Scrolls. We are just getting started.